Muchas gracias, Barbara. Buenos días, y lo siento, mi español es muy malo. So if you don't mind, I think it's better if I finish this talk in English. I am going to give you a very brief overview of the history of whaling in general in the Southern Ocean, and then Julia will tell you about the extensive illegal whaling that was conducted by the Soviet Union following World War II. Today we see many populations of whales in the Southern Hemisphere apparently recovering well from whaling, but there are some that are not. One example is the population of humpback whales in Oceania, which is at a lower abundance than we would expect after many years free from whaling. And there are also a number of populations which have apparently not recovered. There's a couple that seem to have been completely out, and two of the better examples of this are humpback whales and blue whales at South Georgia. The waters of South Georgia once were host to thousands of these animals, and now in recent years it has been extremely rare to see them, although there's some encouraging signs that humpback whales may be coming back. And in fact, it was at South Georgia that modern whaling in the Southern Ocean began. In 1902, the Norwegian whaler Carl Anton Larsen came into the waters of South Georgia for the first time, and he said, "I see them in hundreds and thousands," an indication of how abundant the whales were there. 2 years later, by December of 1904, he and 60 other Norwegians had managed the considerable feat of constructing an entire whaling station at a place called Grutviken in South Georgia, and they began whaling there. In their first year, they took 184 whales, and they made a profit, and in the 10 years leading up to World War I, they killed almost 30,000 whales. Most of those whales were humpbacks, and in fact that was the majority of the humpback population. Humpbacks were almost wiped out by about 1915. And if you look at some other numbers from South Georgia and from this region generally, from South Shetland also, this is a testament to just how productive these waters were. In the space of about 6 decades, starting in 1904, they killed well over 200,000 whales in what was really a relatively small area. So it gives you an idea of how productive the Antarctic was. Again, humpbacks and blue whales and fin whales are very prominent. The problem with a shore station was twofold. First of all, it meant that the catcher boats had a very limited range, and therefore they could not hunt too far because of spoilage. That is, the carcasses, if you went too far, the carcasses would be too rotten when you brought them back to process. The other problem was that the British levied some very high taxes on the whaling operations. So in 1923, Larsen actually introduced the first floating factory ship, the Sir James Clark Ross, which meant that they were free from their ties to land. They could hunt whales anywhere and process them at sea. And in 1925, a factory ship called the Lansing became the first factory ship with a stern slip, that is a slipway at the back, which they could bring whales up and process them on deck. So this really revolutionized whaling and allowed whalers to range all over the Antarctic. So a general timeline, again, 1904 was the beginning in South Georgia. The first factory ships were introduced. The total catch in 1929 was 40,000 whales. It was so profitable and there were so many whales that in 1930 there were 38 factory ships and 184 catches operating. The first attempt to regulate whaling came in 1931, and ironically in that year more than 29,000 blue whales were killed. The first Japanese factory ship began working in the Antarctic in 1934. A second attempt, the International Agreement for the Regulation of Whaling, was signed, and that was actually the peak year for whaling that year so far, 46,000 whales killed. Finally, in 1946, we get the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, which is what we still have today. That's what governs whaling today. It created the International Whaling Commission. And the following year, the Soviets entered the Antarctic for the first time with their factory ship Slava, which we'll hear more about in a moment. And by 1964, the populations had been so diminished that the total catch of blue whales was just 20 animals. And a few more dates. 1972, the Whaling Commission introduced the International Observer Scheme. This was an attempt to stop cheating. It allowed whalers to, it required that there be international observers from other countries on factory ships and at whaling stations. So in theory, it prevented cheating. In 1982, the IWC passed the moratorium on whaling, and then 2 years later adopted the Southern Ocean Sanctuary. And today, the only whaling that's being conducted in the Antarctic is so-called special permit whaling by Japan. This is a way of, it exploits a loophole in the convention which allows whales to be taken for scientific research. A few more figures. The number of animals taken was really quite amazing. In the 1930s, over 150,000 blue whales were killed, and in just one decade, the 1950s, 250,000 fin whales were killed. And the total 20th century catch was over 2 million whales. Here are the total numbers, pretty staggering. 720,000 fin whales, 369,000 blue whales, 400,000 sperm whales, 200,000 humpback and sei whales. Again, the Whaling Commission was created in 1946 by the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling. The idea was to to be able to assess the stocks of whales, and in doing that, to allow for sustainable catches. It was a very noble idea. It didn't work too well, however. And everyone signed this, including the Soviet Union. But the problem with the whaling, of course, is the same with any resource, which is that when the resource is abundant, everyone gets into the business, and then you have all these very expensive factory ships and catches. You have a lot of capital out there, so there's a very strong incentive to deny that there is anything wrong. And in the 1950s, despite increasing evidence that the populations were declining, catches remained high and the populations were declining. So in this time, what we knew was happening was pretty bad. As it turned out, things were much worse than we actually knew. And in 1965, an Australian biologist by the name of Graham Chittleborough published a paper, a very big paper, on humpback whales. And he said in the middle of this paper, he calculated mortality rates, and he said, there's something wrong here. The only way to explain this is that there must be substantial, unreported catches being made. And he didn't say who he thought it was. And really no one took it up until some 30 years later when we found out what was really going on. And at this point, I'm going to turn this over to my wife.
Thank you. You can do it. The Soviet whaling history was the history of one of the participants in the Antarctic whaling, and Soviets started whaling in this area pretty late relative to everybody else. So in 1993, Alexei Yablokov revealed the truth about the long-term campaign of illegal Soviet whaling. And in the following years, a group of former Soviet scientists tried to recover the true catch data, and this effort was led by Bob Brunel and Alexei Yablokov. So today, we know most of the pretty much complete true catches of Soviet whalers in the Antarctic. And to begin with, Soviet whaling overall started in 1932 with very small whaling fleet that worked in the North Pacific. And as you heard, the first Soviet whaling fleet enter Antarctica was Slava in 1947. Although it took some time, and by end of 50s, 1959, Soviets started to add more whaling fleets in the Antarctic, and it was already, despite the knowledge of the declining populations and obvious signs of that, they added 3 very large whaling fleets. 2 of them, Sovietskaya Ukraina and Sovietskaya Russia, were the 2 largest ever built fleets. Each one had up to 25 catchers. And the difference with Soviet whaling was that the whalers were not constrained by the need of immediate profit. It was a state-owned industry, and it was completely belonging to the state, so you didn't need to make profit to survive in this business. In this case, the industry, whaling industry, as many other industries in the Soviet Union, were driven by planning targets that were set by the ministry. So it was numbers that was important in this case, and if you met the targets, you make the profit, you get the bonus. But you actually didn't worry about the products and efficiency of catches. And I want to give a brief kind of summary what this planning system was about and what was wrong with it. Let's take an individual whaling fleet. And for each fleet, the ministry will set number of whales that they have to catch as a target. And also they will express this number of whales as the total output products or total weight of the whales they caught. So whales will have to work hard because these numbers were very high to begin with, and if they meet this target and get 100% of what they were expected to do, they bonus on top of their salary, and it was calculated by months, and at the end of the year it will be 25%. But if you were lucky, you had good weather, you had many more whales to find, and you exceeded either monthly or yearly target by 20%, your bonus will increase significantly to 60%. That's pretty clear incentive you want to catch more and more whales. The problem with this system that next year the ministry will take your previous year catches and set it as a target, base target. So you will need to catch even more whales in terms of to get bonuses. And this ever increasing catches could not be sustained by already declining populations. And it's kind of an example of what targets they were set, that each whaling fleet was set by the ministry. On the bottom row, it's a total output. It's another kind of unique measure what Soviet whaling system was using. They will take the total calculated weight of whales. Doesn't matter how much products you will get from that, but you will take this total weight as the result, total number, and it was like 3 times higher than actual amount of products you can get from whales. And there was a secondary target that was set for individual products that was not as critical, but also will have some importance. And to get this high number of whales, you have to be very efficient. So Soviet whalers, even if they had the late start, they became efficient very quickly. It was highly mechanized process, and they would kill many whales and they could process many whales. On the large fleet factory ships, in a day they would process sometimes up to 200 small sperm whales, or they could process in a day 100 humpback whales, or 30 to 35 pygmy blue whales. Alongside with this high efficiency comes waste and inefficient way of doing it, because catchers will bring so many whales that even efficient processing teams couldn't deal with that, so carcass will rotten, only blubber will be stripped, and the rest of the carcass will be thrown out. But the whole whale will still be recorded toward the target. So the numbers will keep growing even if you don't process the whole whales. And this system was not without its internal critics, because I came across a number of comments and criticism from Soviet scientists who worked with the data, and also captain on the whaling fleets that was saying that this way is not good of managing resources and not efficient to do that. Despite this comments and efforts of scientists to change it, the ministry pretty much ignored anything that was said by science at that time. And as scientists commented, that some of the areas, this is in regard to North Pacific, some of the areas became deserts after Soviet whaling fleet finished to work there. And as one of the very bright examples how this intense catches influenced the population and brought an impact, it's catches of humpback whales by Soviet whalers in the southern hemisphere. And in all years that they worked there, they only got around 50,000 whales. But if you will look at the detailed catches by year, in 59, 60, 60, 61, you can see that pretty much it was working only 2 whaling fleets. They got more than 25,000 of humpback whales. And out of all of them, they reported to 2,700 to the AWC. The rest was unknown until 20 years ago. So, and these intense catches were happening in the Antarctic waters south of eastern Australia and Oceania, and the effect was immediate. The whaling stations in Australia and New Zealand, they had declining catches, and 2 years they were just out of business. There was no whales left. And for a long time, everybody assumed, even if many people were suspicious of Soviet whaling cheating, and everybody assumed that in 1972, when international observers came on every factory ship, this illegal catches and falsification stopped. But as we know now, Soviet whalers got around that rule and continued some amount of illegal catches. And ironically, it was Japanese observers who were working on the Soviet factory ships and Russian observers on Japanese. And at the same time, Soviet Union was selling whale meat to Japan. So kind of very convenient arrangements. This is the total numbers of catches by species, and I just mostly wanted to draw your attention to the 4 species that the difference is actual catches and what they reported at the time to the IWC. And of course, the difference sometimes was just staggering, and it could not have effect on the calculation and assumptions that scientists did for all these years without knowing the true numbers. So in the total, you can see that between what Soviet whalers reported of 185,000 and actually took, its difference is 150,000 whales. And if these numbers were unknown for a long time, and if you're trying to make some assumptions of how many whales is left there, you will make a big mistake when you're missing such a number. And also, Soviet Union presents one of the kind of worst examples of managing resources and doing things, but it was part of the global effort by a number of countries and very poor management by the IWC, and on top of the overfishing by a number of other countries, it just brought many populations to a crash and significant decline. And it was quite a challenge sometimes to discover this data and to get the details of how things were happening, because it never was straight in Soviet Union. And a number of people helped me in this effort, and I want to say thank you to them. And also mention a few papers that came out from this work that describes in more detail the kind of unique situation with the system that existed because of economical and political situation in this country, but I'm sure would be somewhat different in each country. And I want to finish and say thank you with this small funny note. Thank you.